I work at a museum, and one of the fun things about working at a museum is you get an awful lot of artifacts that come in. Uh, Sometimes, there's stuff that we find in our research, and sometimes it's stuff that's brought in by collectors, and you never really know what's going to come in the door. Uh, we in Alberta, we're the central repository for all of the archaeological material in the province of Alberta, and we have in the order of 14 million items in our inventory.
Wow.
The vast majority of it is stuff that wouldn't be exhibit worthy. A lot of it has research potential, but that includes an awful lot of chaff. But amongst it, there are some real gems, and one of them that I have the pleasure to work with is a bunch of bison effigies that have come in and over the years, and this paper is about my interpretation of these. None of them were excavated by an archaeologist. They were all found by amateurs, farmers, usually in plowed fields. And anyway, I'm just going to proceed here. So,
Bob.
Yeah.
There's a little thing on the bottom of your screen that says sharing your screen, and we don't want you to stop sharing, but if you, perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All good. Okay.
Perfect.
This is a little wordy, so I'll just run along here. Pre-contact and early post-contact Aboriginal stone sculpture of any kind in the Northern Plains is extremely rare. In his book, Plains Indian Sculpture, John Ewers primarily illustrates stone sculpture manifest as zoomorphic and anthropomorphic carvings on tobacco pipes. The notable exceptions are the groundstone bison effigies that cut a swath across the northern fringe of the plains from Alberta to Minnesota. These bison sculptures are generally regarded as charms used for ceremonial use to invoke bison hunting success. Various descriptions of these stone bison effigies have been published, and several have now found their way into museum exhibits. Although doubtless more exist, the ones foremost in the literature and accessible in museum displays include 4 specimens from each of Alberta, North Dakota, Saskatchewan, and 1 each from Minnesota, Wyoming, and Montana. This map shows the distribution of known carved stone bison on the Northern Plains. For the most part, this is now parkland. You can see this dippled or stippled green area is parkland. And there's seen a conspicuous void in the middle of what is prime bison hunting habitat on the short grass plains. Like there's an absence of these things in this area. In this area, nature has provided a ready-made bison charm in the form of disarticulated septa of fossil ammonites, which occur naturally in this area. These baculite sections often remarkably resemble bison, and these bison stones have been given the Blackfoot name Inniskim. When we compare the distribution of sites bearing Inniskim with actual bison carvings, we can see the complementary distribution between these 2 types of charms covers much of the area exploited by bison hunters. Hunting magic seems to have gone hand in hand with hunting bison. On this map, the red dots are the locations of carved stone effigies. The fine spots of ammonite Inniskim are black label dots. Both the types of objects performed a role in culling buffalo and were vital in conjuring the success of a buffalo hunt. As an indication of the strong belief in this kind of magic conveyed by Inniskim, in an excavation of the Majorville Medicine Wheel in Alberta, for example, 43 Inniskim were recovered in what had been left as offerings in the central cairn, only half of which had been excavated. So this sort of shows the importance of this vital object in their belief system. Where Inniskim were not available, the perceived need for charms to enhance opportunities to attract buffalo was apparently met by carving effigies to resemble bison, with the end result ranging from something abstract and minimalist to very detailed, anatomically accurate renderings. Although the significance of the role of these objects, whether natural or contrived, cannot be denied, it is improbable we will learn the nature of the specific ceremonies that these objects participated in. In this paper, though, I describe the carved bison effigies that have been treated with additional levels of symbolism, and especially 3 in particular that I believe demonstrate a level of imparted magic not evident in other buffalo stones. The 4 Alberta carved bison effigies have been recovered in plowed fields in the northern parkland fringe. 2 effigies were recovered 65 years apart in a plowed field on the same land formed by different generations of the same family in Barhead, Alberta. These 2 off on the left here. The other 2 Alberta specimens were recovered a little more than 200 kilometers to the east on either side of the North Saskatchewan River. With the exception of the Ardmore effigy on the bottom right, made of steatite, the other 3 Alberta figurines are carved from lumps of bituminous coal. I will discuss these ones a little later. In Saskatchewan, 4 effigies have been found in the Aspen Grove parklands. 2 are of quartzite, 1 of quartz, and 1 of natural asphalt. The quartzite specimen on the lower left was found in a field near Saskatoon, crushed into pieces under the weight of the steel lugs of a tractor wheel. The effigy was thought to have originated from a 9-inch soil deposit in an area that had produced artifacts extending back to agate basin times. The white quartz effigy was found in a barn foundation near Melville. The red quartzite specimen is most highly modified of the Saskatchewan effigies. The 3 artifacts share the common attributes of extended tongue, protuberant hump, eyes, horns, and stylized legs, all carved in high relief. 2 have a tail stub, and the red one also has nostrils and a vulva. The highly polished asphalt specimen found on a knoll near a spring near Middle Lake differs from the other 3. That'd be the one on the top right here. It has facial features that are incised rather than carved in relief, and is nowhere near as well worked as the other ones. 3 of the reported North Dakota specimens are made of granite, and 1 is apparently quartzite. The Williston effigy was reported as being excavated from a depth of 4 feet while building a hotel foundation in 1898. This copy of a photo of the Williston effigy on the top left here shows considerable similarity to the effigy from Carpio on the top right. First reported in 1925, details of the Carpio recovery are unknown. The Thompson effigy was plowed up around 1920, and one wonders if the artist selected this rock with the longitudinally trending quartz seam as having a ready-made lifeline. The Minnesota effigy on the bottom right here is very minimally executed on a lump of brown sandstone and was reported as being found in an Indian village. Ewers describes a fine effigy from Wind River, Wyoming as a bison, this one on the bottom left. This artifact, however, I think could easily be interpreted as a bighorn sheep with curled horns and a neck, narrow compared to all other bison effigies. The 2-legged bison described by Ewers from Montana on the top right similarly has decidedly non-typical features, and I think could perhaps be a bear, again with a narrow neck, and in this case a concave snout. Regardless of whether these 2 are considered bison, clearly they have no similarity to the other Northern Plains bison effigies, and I won't continue to chat about those 2. Where it is apparent that the Alberta, Saskatchewan, and North Dakota specimens in particular are variations on the same theme, the Alberta specimens seen here on the left column are different in that they exhibit true representational art with anatomic accuracy not evident in the other effigies. This was partly a function of the relative ease of carving, in 3 instances coal and in the other instance steatite. The 4 Alberta specimens share the common attributes of 4 projecting limbs, a prominent hump with arched back, tails and/or genitalia, open incised mouths with, in 3 cases, extended tongues, incised nostrils, eye orbits in high relief, defined muzzle, and discrete ears and horns. The Ardmore effigy The largest of the bunch was found in the 1950s. Again, this is steatite. Was found on a farm 1/2 mile south of Ardmore, Alberta, stuck between the teeth of a rock picker. Apparently, the Norwegian farmer that found it brought it into the local pub, where he apparently mentioned that he also found a carving of a fish of the same stone. He threw this ladder into his rock pile because the tail was broken off and he didn't think anybody would want a broken carved fish. We went and tried to find it after the fact and could never find it, sadly. We wanted that fish. Anyway, after first coming to the attention of Alan Bryan and Ruth Gruen at the University of Alberta in 1963, the Ardmore bison effigy was obtained by the Glenbow Museum in 1964, where it still resides. The Ardmore effigy is well proportioned with elaborate detail and realism typical of the Alberta effigies, with discrete horns and ears, an extended tongue, and well-modeled muzzle. It differs from the other 3 Alberta specimens in that its eyes are hollow. At the time the artifact was recovered in the 50s, it was shown to some Cree elders, one who was about 85 years old at the time. He said he remembered being told that the stones that looked like this were carried by the leader of a buffalo hunt to make it successful. The Ardmore effigy is the one known soapstone bison effigy. Soapstone does not occur naturally in Alberta. The closest sources are in British Columbia to the west and to the Canadian Shield in the Northwest Territories. Although shield erratics distributed by glacial activity are common in the central Alberta plains, the soft nature of this rock argues against any long-distance transport by glacial activity. It is most probable the stone was obtained by trade. Given the resemblance to other central Alberta effigies, the artifact itself is probably of local manufacture. The barhead effigies, just to remind you, were recovered from the same knoll in the same field, but decades apart. The 2 effigies have been recovered beside a creek on a farm near Barhead, Alberta. Various other artifacts representing multiple occupations have been recovered from this area. The first effigy, made of detritus coal, was recovered in 1944, the top one. This has suffered considerable post-depositional trauma, resulting in breakage of much of the projecting elements, including limbs, eyes, ears, and horns. Unlike the other Alberta effigies, the nostrils were drilled holes and the mouth was etched. A tail is represented above a lump between the hind legs, which Zierhut interpreted as a male sex organ, but this could alternatively be interpreted as an udder. Hence, in this case, we believe the sex is ambiguous. I'm not sure. In 1968, a local 94-year-old Cree elder was consulted to see if he could shed light on this object, but he had never seen one and had no idea how it functioned. The second effigy found by the same family, also of coal, was recovered in 2012. This artifact appears to have suffered significant post-depositional damage as well as erosion of the surface. Should be remembered that this has been plowed around for almost 80 years longer than the other object, so it's kind of amazing that any of it's intact, given that it's coal. The chance recovery of the highly weathered fragmentary second barhead specimen probably owes its recovery to the fact that the person who found it was familiar with the first specimen. Even then, it had survived 65 years of cultivation. We will never know how many other, especially coal effigies, have been relentlessly plowed into oblivion as so many dark gray lumps in the clay soils of the Alberta parkland. It's hard to imagine how many of these could have been destroyed. Despite its weathered condition, the second barhead effigy exhibited considerable detail, demonstrating not just artistic skill, but a faithful, anatomically correct representation of a bison cow. It varies from the first effigy in that it has more accurate execution of nostrils and mouth, including a protruding tongue. It incorporates an anus, a vulva, and rectangular loid udder complete with 4 teats. The proportions, particularly through the body, are also more accurate, as a section of the first effigy is somewhat squat and pig-like. Despite their close proximity, the features of the 2 barhead effigies are dissimilar enough to indicate they were made by a different artist. This is not as easy to discount with the similarity of the second barhead effigy with that found in Beauvalon 200 kilometers to the east on the other side of the North Saskatchewan River. This fourth Alberta bison figurine is the Beauvalon effigy, which, even in damaged condition, is arguably the most elegant rendering of any bison in any medium, which in this case is coal. Found in 1949, this specimen gathered dust on a farm building ledge until it was brought to Bob Kidd, then curator of archaeology at the Provincial Museum, approximately 40 years ago. The specimen was offered to the museum for the price of $100, which was rejected at the time as the museum had a policy not to buy archaeological specimens. The Beauvalon effigy is almost identical to barhead number 2, with the well-proportioned body with separate ears and horns, eyes carved in high relief with circumventing orbit, open mouth with extended tongue, mottled nostrils, the stub of a tail, an anus, a vulva, and, identical to barhead number 2, a rectanguloid udder with 4 teats. The anatomical detail rendered by the artists in some of these specimens is remarkable. An elevated eye is a common theme in most plains bison effigies, and in the case of the Beauvalon barhead number 2 and the Saskatoon effigy, an etched ring also describes the eye orbit, mimicking the raised orbit observed about the bison eye. On the Ardmore, Beauvalon, and barhead number 2 specimens, the nostrils are faithfully rendered in an almost gull-wing fashion to faithfully represent the nostril flap, rather than just etching a hole as in the case of barhead number 1. The well-defined treatment of the muzzle should also be observed with an open, down-turned mouth and protruding tongue. The choice of intractable quartz and granite limited the ability of the Saskatchewan and North Dakota artists to impart detail into their sculptures, resulting in more stylized and abstract forms. Despite the difficulty in carving detail into these other extremely tough materials, it should be noted that the second most common attribute amongst all the Northern Plains bison effigies, second only to the presence of a hump, is the presence of an extended tongue in 8 of these, including the ones made out of granite and quartzite. This was obviously critical consideration. An extended tongue is an indication of an animal laboring or in labor. Bourgamont observed this of the Plains Apache hunting bison on horseback. Quote, "They ride about 2 or 3 leagues from their camp where they find herds of bison, usually 300 to 400. They start to torment them and run them hard until their tongues stick out a foot. Then they choose the fattest ones and shoot arrows into them, which penetrate a foot into the animals' bellies." Unquote. An extended tongue on an effigy might also validate that particular rendering as one of an especially desirable bison, because the tongue is generally regarded as the choice portion. This was obviously an important element, and is my interpretation that the tongue is hanging out, symbolic of a bison running, or rather being run, as if being successfully stalked or driven. Another possibility is that this is demonstration of a desired outcome. In addition to protruding tongues, these effigies characteristically have extremely well-endowed thoracic humps. Given that the 2 most coveted meat portions of a bison are the tongue and the hump, respectively, the emphasis on these effigies may have had some role in symbolic magic of conjuring up the fattest, most desirable of game in a bountiful hunt. Even the rear end of the 4 Alberta effigies have been paid attention to. As mentioned above, 2 effigies clearly exhibit an anus and vulva, the 2 on the left. The other 2 on the right, I think, are equipped with tails. It would have been much easier for the artist to demarcate the separation between the hind legs with a simple groove, but this is accomplished on both these specimens by the careful incision of 2 parallel grooves which effectively describe a tail, much as can be observed hanging down on the bison, on bison. Given the observed careful attention to anatomical detail exhibited by all of these, it is tempting to view all of these effigies as depicting cows. Obviously, Beauvalon and barhead number 2, with both vulvas and udders, are cows. And if the lump under the rear end of barhead number 1 is interpreted as an udder, it also supports this view. It should be observed that even in the tough raw materials of quartzite and granite, the artists of each of the Saskatchewan and North Dakota effigies clearly went to great trouble to incorporate vulvas in their carvings. If we examine the morphology of the back on the Alberta carvings, the hump in each case is both pronounced and set forward at least over the front legs, which, other than looking at the private parts, is one of the best ways to discriminate a bison cow from a bull. Bulls tend to have a broader hump centered farther back from the front legs. All four are slightly sway-backed, a condition peculiar to mature cows. Although this is certainly speculative, I think this is a reasonable possibility we should consider, that these are cows. They have the sway back and forward biased hump. When we further examine the thoracic hump on the Alberta figurines, it is apparent that the idea of what a bison looks like, the same mental template, was not shared between the maker of barhead number 1 with that of the other 3 Alberta specimens. At first, I had written off this forward projecting angular hump as lack of artistic ability, as this was the one effigy with drilled nostrils and a tongueless mouth. But alternatively, it may be because the artist was sculpting a slightly different animal. Barhead, which is the dot on the left, the red dot on the left here, can be seen situated in the overlapping wintering ranges of both plains and woods bison. So presumably both of these animals could have been familiar to the inhabitants of the Barhead region, assuming the ranges of these subspecies was similar at the time of occupation. The shape of the thoracic hump of woods buffalo or woods bison in this illustration compares favorably with that of barhead number 1. But again, this is speculative. You know, it's you can see I don't know if you can see the similarity or not, but wood buffalo have this sort of sharp forward biased hump, and this barhead number 1 looks quite similar to what I think. When the first coal effigy found in Alberta in 1941, the barhead number 1 effigy was reported as coming from a plowed field. It came as no surprise that it was broken and had apparent plow damage. Most projections had suffered some level of damage. No wonder. When we think of cultivation trauma, we usually think of the damage done by plowing, but for an artifact embedded in a cultivated field, farm equipment presents a considerable arsenal of devices that could do a medieval torture chamber proud. Not just plows, but discs, rakes, seeders, mowers, harrows, weeders, all designed to render apart any clump-like obstacle, cut it, stab it, chop it, collect it, redistribute it, or impregnate it. So it's little wonder that these charcoal effigies suffered some damage. In some cases, 7 decades of this kind of treatment. Although not the focus of this paper, the soapstone Ardmore effigy on the bottom right here bears significant scars from such treatment, and it was in fact recovered firmly wedged between 2 discs after an episode of tilling. The barhead number 1 effigy also has an assortment of wounds, including the removal of the ears and horns, mutilation of the shoulders and eyes, and the most invasive damage was from a pair of blows directed upward on either side of what could be interpreted as either a scrotum or an udder to amputate the lower portion of each hind leg. You can see that particularly in this bottom right-hand image. There was a blow that took off either leg from either side of the scrotum or whatever it is. The genitalia might be observed remained unscathed, which is an important consideration, especially if you like your scrotum, your genitalia. When the second coal effigy was reported, the bovilon effigy, it came as no surprise that it too had been broken, again, apparently a consequence of being recovered from a cultivated field. The bovilon effigy, in contrast to the first barhead specimen, is a stunning piece of sculpture. Even Even in damaged condition, this is arguably the most elegant rendering of a bison in a medium, which in this case is coal. Although it too had been stripped of projecting surfaces such as the ears and horns, the one major fracture of this artifact was again initiated from near the center of the ventral side. So right here, you can actually see, looking down on the ventral side, some impact cracks from something delivering a blow that way. Removing most of one side of the specimen parallel to the medial axis from front to back. This fracture was initiated from near the center of the abdomen. This is clearly a cow and pregnant. The distended belly, pronounced teats on the udder, and particularly the swollen vulva are indicative of a cow near birthing. The tongue hanging out and the bulging eyes are also consistent with the bison cow in labor. The attention to detail by the artist that produced this is remarkable. A stump of a tail and an anus leave no doubt of the position and condition of the vulva. The eye orbits can be seen to be faithfully carved in high relief. The nostrils are faithfully rendered in an almost gullwing fashion to faithfully represent the nostril flap, and even the thin transverse ridge of fat above the snout is evident. And when I say that, I mean, you can see this little ridge here above the snout, and you see that on bison as well. A lot of effort went into making this anatomically correct and an exact replica. It should be observed that the artist oriented the bedding of the coal parallel to the medial plane. This orientation would ensure bilateral symmetry during carving. The vertical cracks seen pushing the specimen apart along the bedding, you can see these cracks, are a recent phenomenon and would not have been evident at the time of use or manufacture. This is apparently a growth of pyrite in the coal, pyrite crystals, and expanding crystal growth is pushing this thing apart. Unfortunately, there's no way to arrest this. So sadly, our specimen is getting a little bit wrecked. But a few years ago, a farmer brought in a third coal effigy to our museum, and this too from Barhead. It was covered in clay and didn't look like much, but because his grandparents recovered the first Barhead effigy some 65 years earlier on the same knoll from the same field, he recognized it might be something similar. This artifact was so badly beaten up and weathered all over from being subjected to weathering and cultivation torture for 64 years. It didn't look like much when it first came in until we applied conservation. Despite its weathered condition, the second Barhead effigy exhibited considerable detail, demonstrating not just artistic skill, but a faithful, anatomically correct representation, again, of a bison cow. It varies from the Barhead #1 effigy in that it has more accurate execution of nostrils and mouth, including a protruding tongue, incorporates an anus, vulva, and the udder complete with 4 teats. The proportions, particularly through the body, are also more accurate, as a section of the first effigy is somewhat squat. Despite being found on the same knoll, the features of the 2 Barhead effigies are dissimilar enough to indicate they were made by a different artist. What is startling is the similarity to the boviline effigy of this one, an effigy found 60 years earlier by a different unrelated family more than 200 kilometers, that is 135 miles away. These are images of the 2 that were found 135 miles apart. The Barhead specimen on the right, I had to blow up because it's 2/3 the size of the boviline one. But you can see, and again, you have to remember this one on the right was subjected to 65 years more of cultivation than the other one. Was really beaten up badly, but you can still see the eye orbit very similar, the gull wing nostrils, the tongue sticking out of the mouth. Its proportions are phenomenal. It is smaller, but all the elements present on bovolon are similarly executed on the barhead specimen, except for the nasal ridge described earlier. Like, it doesn't have this little ridge. That's the only thing that this guy doesn't have that the one on the left has. Let's just models. It also has mottled nostrils, stub of a tail, an anus, vulva, and a rectanguloid udder with 4 teats. An identical split from the abdomen towards the posterior side has similarly cleaved off one side of the effigy from front to back. Again, I've blown these up. The bovolon specimen is actual size. This is blown up. Again, this one would be 2/3 the size of the other one, and this is a view of the broken side, and this is an oblique view showing part of the bottom of these two. But these are two separate effigies found 135 miles apart, and even in here you can see the udder there with the 4 teats, and the udder here with the 4 teats. They look dissimilar in size in this view because, again, this one on the right is blown up, but they're actually exactly the same size. And there's a reason for that. I'll get into it in a little bit. An identical split from the abdomen towards the posterior side has similarly cleaved off one side of the effigy from front to back, although it is the opposite side. Despite the obvious cultivation trauma on pretty much every effigy recovered from cultivated fields, I do not think the significant damage that broke any of the 3 coal effigies was delivered by coincidence. Given an infinite number of bison effigies subjected to decades of cultivation-inspired destructive forces, sooner or later some similar fractures could be expected. But we are not talking about an infinite sample of coal effigies. Our entire sample consists of 3, all 3 of which had to be firmly supported and impacted in the identical trajectory by a similar force with a similarly shaped impactor parallel to the medial plane and perpendicular to the abdomen. Such a force was delivered to the ventral side of the effigies, the side partly protected by the legs, and without damaging the udders. The similarity of the fracture in every respect, particularly between bovolon and barhead number 2 effigies, are particularly startling. For this to be coincidental would almost be as likely as finding monkeys writing Shakespeare. To meet all these conditions in every known case has to be deliberate. When we compare these latter 2 effigies corrected for scale, we see a virtual mirror image. Remember, these artifacts were found more than 200 kilometers apart. There is no way the commonalities observed between these 2 specimens is coincidence. I believe they had to have been made by the same person. Beyond the duplication of attributes, just the relative proportions achieved go beyond mimicry. It is more like muscle memory to get the proportions so similar. If at the very least, if 2 artists were involved, they had to have seen the other object, or perhaps one of the several identical copies to so faithfully duplicate it. As hard as it is to believe we found 2 objects made by the same person 135 miles apart, it would be even harder to believe that we found the only 2 objects made by the same person 135 miles apart. I would, it's my belief there was specialists that made many copies of this, and we found 2 of them. There could be dozens of them out there. There could be hundreds. That's speculative, of course, but maybe not unrealistic. It should be remembered that barhead specimen was carved from a smaller piece of coal and was weathered for more than half a century more than the bovolon specimen. A view of the ventral face shows what appears to be disproportionately large udder on the barhead figure. It had to be. In actual size, these udders and teats are the same size, probably because there is a limit to how small you can carve that detailed an attribute. They're both formed as slightly elevated rectangular area with 4 distinct teats. The chance that these 2 artifacts found so far apart were so identically proportioned in every respect, including even the nature of the fracture that split them, could be coincidence. It is like our monkeys now graduating from writing Shakespeare to writing the law of relativity. What seems to make the most sense is these effigies were made by the same person, perhaps a craft specialist, a shaman, or a pound maker. Whoever it was certainly an artist. That two of these were identical signifies that they were most likely to have been made by one person who may have made dozens, because it is more likely that one person, a craft specialist, distributed several identical objects, of which we found two, than we found both of the only two produced, as I mentioned earlier. It is harder to explain how two different ones ended up in the same spot at Barrhead. Remember, the two that were found on the same knoll were quite different. Perhaps Barrhead number one, this one down in the bottom left-hand corner, represents an effigy needed for a ritual that was made by a different, less skilled artist than the one who made these other two. But he was aware of the ritual posed by these other specimens, and perhaps tried to copy it. Not as successfully. One of the things about the artist that made these two that split so nicely is he oriented the grain of the coal longitudinally in such a fashion that he knew if he was to jab something in the gut, it would split in half. And the cleavage, or whatever it is, the bedding in the coal specimen on the bottom left, didn't behave quite so nicely. I think that the artist that made the one on the left, it's not a bad carving, but it's clearly not, the level of faithful reproduction that the other two represent. He maybe just was not that skilled and didn't know how to pull it off as well. He tried, though. I think he must have known about the other ones. He saw it. He probably tried to mimic it. We can only speculate how important a function these artifacts may have played in a ceremonial context for a cultural group who depended on bison for survival. There are numerous accounts of charms being used, particularly for communal bison hunting, such as in the production of bison pounds. For example, De Smet mentions, quote, "The hunt is preceded by a great variety of superstitious practices," unquote, among which included a medicine mast in the middle of a pound bearing 3 charms. Pound makers were even recorded mounting a pole or a tree in a pound to draw on the buffalo. Charms could be used in pre-hunt rituals. Kaiser and Klassen have indicated, quote, "Religious rituals designed to increase bison fertility form the core of much Northwestern Plains cosmology, even as recently as the ghost dance religion of the late 1880s, which was intended to bring back the bison that had been overhunted to the edge of extinction," unquote. The coal effigies from the northwest corner of the plains provided a necessary function in the spirituality of the indigenous groups that depended on bison for survival. The act of purposefully splitting these effigies apparently performed a symbolic function. It is unlikely we will ever know what the function was unless a similar object is recovered in a context that would make this purpose clear. Purposefully breaking artifacts is a widespread symbolic practice to achieve a variety of different purposes. What seems most appropriate for these specimens is that they were part of a sympathetic magic ritual involving either hunting magic, where the effigies were ritually killed to conjure a successful outcome of a buffalo hunt, or alternatively, the purpose was to symbolize the birthing of bison to ensure the fecundity of the herd and a continued supply of the critical resource relied on by Plains people. The possibility that the fracture was induced to kill the effigy is very plausible, and there are considerable precedents to this practice worldwide. It is easy to consider such a ritually killed object as a grave good accompanying a noble figure, perhaps even a pound maker or shaman involved in bison hunting ceremony. But in this case, if this was the case, would it be critical that the object of this ritual was a pregnant female? Perhaps. But it should be considered that great care was made to identify these effigies, whether coal or stone, as female, and great care was exercised to retain that identity by not affecting the udders or genitalia by the intentional breakage, as we have seen in the coal effigies. Further, all 3 of these latter were stabbed in the abdomen or womb. If the object of this breakage was to symbolize simply killing the bison, the breakage could be initiated from anywhere, and any hunter would know the belly would not normally be the target area should you want to kill a bison. Better in the area of a shoulder. Kaiser and Whitley have documented sympathetic magic for hunting success indicated by rock art in the Columbia Plateau. The examples they illustrate clearly show hunters attacking the shoulder area of their quarry from the back or posterior side. Henry Buell, one of the first to postulate sympathetic magic in cave art, apparently regarded this cave art in France as hunting magic. On the bottom left here, you can see arrows coming up into the abdomen. So maybe he was wrong. This isn't hunting magic. Maybe it could be an instruction manual for how to split open bison effigies. That's my interpretation. Just being facetious. The 3 Alberta coal effigies were from the northwest fringe of the plains, an area most recently occupied by the Cree. So it is perhaps fitting that Mandelbaum provides this observation of the Plains Cree. Quote, another way in which an object or evil medicine might enter the body was through the use of sympathetic magic. The shaman might mold the figure of a man in clay or cut out the hide in the shape of a person. The intrusive object was inserted into that part of the body which was to be affected. Interesting. The intrusive object, I repeat, the intrusive object was inserted into that part of the body which is to be affected, or in the case of the hide figure, medicine was placed over that part, unquote. Either interpretation of hunting magic or rebirthing are plausible. I do prefer the rebirthing interpretation. The orientation of applied force into what could be interpreted as the womb, and the great care in identifying and preserving the gender identity of these effigies as female, most specifically as pregnant cows. I think that's a factor. My interpretation is that the practice of the insertion of an implement into the ventral side of these effigies to split them open was a ritual designed to free the spirit of a bison calf from the womb. That someone would spend so much time and effort to create such a phenomenal piece of art just to destroy it speaks to not just a practice, an incredible sacrifice, but also demonstrates the importance of transferring this power and belief in this magic. Hunting magic was critical in the belief system of most hunting societies, and nowhere more evident than what we have seen amongst the indigenous buffalo hunting people of the plains. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was really great.
Too long or too short?
Just right. It was perfect. Are there any questions from the floor? I don't see any on the chat at this point.
Are there any questions here? Question.
Is there anybody still awake?
Did you catch that, Bob?
I can't hear it, no.
Okay. The question is there any evidence of pigment on any of those little sculptures? And number two, second part of the question, where did they get the coal?
Well, the answer to the first question, there's no evidence of pigment. We looked, you know, we were hoping to find some pigment, but we haven't found any. I haven't been able to closely examine any of the bison effigies, or not all of the bison effigies from Saskatchewan, and using ID stretch on the ones that we have showed up no evidence of ochre. We're sort of disappointed. We were hoping to find it. But the answer to that is no. What was the other question?
Where did they get the coal, Bob?
Oh, the coal. Coal is ubiquitous in along the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, especially in Alberta. The unusual thing is the coal is fairly homogeneous, and it's hard to find in in that kind of consistency, like in order that you can carve it. I mean, I do quite a bit of carving, especially soapstone. I have never been able to find, and I've been looking, especially since I saw these figurines. I've been looking for a lump of coal that I could carve with that kind of detail that would carry it, that would hold it. It's very hard bituminous coal, and as I say, it's fairly homogeneous. It has to come from not too far away from the source area, somewhere in the upper drainage of the Saskatchewan River. And we tried to source it by using X-ray fluorescence, hoping that we could maybe tie it to some known commercial quarry. But the problem with coal is it's very heterogeneous mineralogically, and we even took 7 readings with our X-ray fluorescence gun on one specimen, and you would never guess, if you looked at any of those 2 readings, they came from the same source, much less the same artifact. You know, radically different readings, and this has been borne out by mining analysis of sediment of coal seams. You know, it's so highly variable that you know, you could never source it, barring a miracle. And so someday we hope to stumble upon some location where there is an outcrop of this stuff. It may just be one little outcrop. I suspect somewhere in the upper Saskatchewan river drainage, but I don't know where.
We do have one question that's come in, and that is, what material was used to do the carving?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that, because that I don't really know, but there had been a publication on that first barhead specimen in the 60s. It was in Nepal, I think is the pronunciation. It was a Saskatchewan quarterly. The archaeologist that studied it said that he believed that the age of these specimens was historic, because he saw what he regarded as filing marks on the coal. And when I examined it, I wasn't so sure. So I did an experiment. I took a couple of files, like a rasp, a file, a stone knife, a metal knife. I took a sample of sandstone, and I carved some soapstone. Used that as an analog, and compared the carving to the scratches that were observed on the coal. And I was able to demonstrate that it was definitely not done by a file. So his interpretation that these things were historic in age was not supported. And rather than being ground, it looks like they were scraped by probably a stone knife. Was the best result that I could get, was that it was actually scraped, not really ground into shape. The workmanship, like to have high relief, you know, to plan a carving like that in high relief, and have it, you know, come off, especially in something that's prone to breakage like coal, incredible. Like I can't emphasize enough how hard that would be. And those quartzite and granite effigies that were carved elsewhere, with the detail and the planning, like to have elevated eye orbits and tongues and vulvas and horns and ears, the proportions all in granite and quartzite, incredibly hard to carve. You know, I don't think they obviously didn't get ritually massacred, because they were virtually indestructible. But what a lot of work to make those. I mean, and I believe there had to have been, like, you know, another question I'm going to anticipate is people are going to ask me how old they are, maybe. And that's another question I'd like to be able to answer, and I can't. because we haven't found any in a good archaeological context. What we do know is Inniskim have been used for up to 5,000 years, but most commonly in the last 2,000 years. And if they're a reasonable analog, I think they are. I mean, I think the bison effigies, the stone carvings, are probably more or less the same age, but they could be older. Like the one in Saskatchewan was found associated with in a field where there was a bunch of agate basin material, but there was probably some later material there too. So it doesn't mean it was an agate basin effigy. And there was also one of the North Dakota specimens was found when they were building the foundation for a barn 4 feet deep under the surface. But as archaeologists, we know that 4 feet can be 10,000 years in one site, and it can be 200 years in another site. So it's just obviously not recent, but of unknown age. But certainly not historic. I don't believe they're historic.
Any other questions? Hey, Bob, thanks. That was a great talk. We really appreciated it. Do us one favor. Tell us how old Agate Basin is.
It's in the order of 10,000 years old.
Okay. So it follows Clovis and Folsom.
Yep.
Okay.
It's ancient.
Thank you very much, Bob. We appreciate it. Nice talk. Cool artifacts.
They are cool artifacts. They're pretty amazing, and I hope we find some more. Keep your eyes open. I know that the distribution of bison doesn't make a huge foray into Oregon, but you never know. They certainly knew what bison looked like there, and they certainly were benefactors of the bison part, stuff trade. There was, and I have every confidence that the people from Western Oregon would make forays across the mountains to have the odd buffalo hunt. So you never know what you're going to find there.
You bet. Okay. Thank you all. This is the end of the meeting for today. We'll see you hopefully in December. And who's talking to December? Zeke?
I believe it's Dennis Jenkins, and I think he's going to do a overview of the Paisley Cave excavations.
Okay. So thanks all for coming.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome. Bye for now. Thanks.
Talk to you soon. Take care.
Go Oilers, go.
Go Rangers.